four-part, 4-week series entitled Called. And what we endeavor to do in this series is to talk about how each and every single one of us is called to do something by the Lord. And we're going to kind of parse between two different kinds of calling. There's going to be a general calling. Like there's certain things that as Christians, as believers, we are all called to do. Like emulate the character and the nature of God. Or like Jesus says, go into all the world and make disciples. General calling. We're all supposed to do those things. But we really want to hone in on and focus on the fact that each and every single one of us individually are called to something very specific, very special, very unique to you. So God has a calling on each and every single person's life here. And that's what we want to explore in this series. So we're going to do that by looking at 4 biblical examples of people who were called to a specific place at a specific time for a specific purpose. And we're going to look at Moses, Nehemiah, Esther, and Timothy over the next 4 weeks. Now we're going to begin this week with Moses, and what makes Moses very unique from these other stories is Nehemiah and Esther, we don't really know a lot about their childhood or their backgrounds. We don't really know a lot. And then with Timothy, we know like a little bit about how he was raised and how he grew up, but not a whole lot. We don't have like a specific narrative or a life story. With Moses, we can see in the Bible Moses' entire story, his entire life, from before his birth till after his death. So that makes it very unique. So we're going to talk about Moses today, and before we do that, I really want to set up the story here, and I want to establish my premise early on, so that we can kind of track it through the sermon, and hopefully you see what I'm talking about as I go through the sermon. Now, when this passage is preached, a lot of times, and this is kind of what I thought when I first sat down to write the sermon and start studying, I kind of thought it was a situation where Moses was walking by the burning bush, and he's like, what's a music stand doing here? Oh, I'll move it. There we go. And Moses is walking by a burning bush, and he's like, whoa, what's happening? This seems like it's out of nowhere. This is crazy. This bush is on fire. It's burning, but it's not consumed. How random. And what are you asking me to do, God? That is so random and out of nowhere. I can't believe it. That's kind of what I thought the sermon would be about. When God randomly out of nowhere calls us to do something. However, as I began to study the text and make myself a servant to the text and really dive into the text deeply, I realized that if you only read Exodus 3, where it talks about the burning bush, then yes, that's very much how it seems. That this random dude is at this random place at a random time. He gets called to do something completely out of nowhere. However, if you read Exodus 1 through 4, you see that this was no accident, this was not random, and there was purpose behind this. And that the text leading up to this point was all in order for God to call Moses at this moment. So my premise I submit to you at the very beginning of the sermon, and keep this in mind, is that everything in Moses' life molded, shaped, and prepared him for what God was going to call him to do. I'm going to say that again. Everything in Moses' life molded, shaped, and prepared him for what God was going to call him to do. So keep that in mind as we go through the sermon today. Now, as always, I like to give some background, some context to what we're talking about, because there's going to be references made in our story back to some things from Genesis. So we need to figure out what those mean, and we need to figure out how our original setting and context came to be. So we're going to go to Genesis real quick, and I've talked about this a bajillion times. And there's this guy named Abram, who gets his name changed from Abram to Abraham, and God makes a covenant with Abraham. And a covenant is a contractual, God puts himself under contractual obligation to Abraham. And he makes him, easiest way to remember this, 3 promises. He promises him land. So he says, your descendants will have a good land to dwell in. He promises him birth. You're going to have a ton of descendants. You're going to multiply like bunnies. And he says there's going to be more from your seed. There's going to be more than the stars in the sky or the beach or the sand on the beach. You're going to have a lot of people come from your line. And kings will come from your line. So Abraham's going to become a great nation through multiplication. Thirdly, God promises blessing. Things will go well with Abraham's descendants into the future. And what's more, we did a whole sermon on this one time. Through blessing Abraham's family, God has in mind, he has an agenda to actually bless all families. The word in Hebrew is families, all families of the earth. So God makes a covenant with Abraham to give him land, birth, and blessing. to become a great nation that is blessed, and through them, all families of the earth will be blessed. Well, from Abraham comes a child, Isaac. From Isaac, down the road, you have Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons. It's a lot of mouths to feed. The grocery bill must have been insane. So he has 12 sons that would become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, the youngest of those sons was named Joseph. And if you were here last week, Brian discussed Joseph a little bit in his sermon. Joseph, the youngest brother of the 12 tribes of Israel, gets, pay attention to this, he gets sold into slavery in Egypt. He gets sold into slavery in Egypt. Now, this is foreshadowing of what's going to happen down the road. This is kind of like a preview, a little spoiler alert, a little hint of what's going to happen down the road. A Hebrew man, Joseph, gets sold into slavery in Egypt. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Egypt during this time. Egypt was, from their frame of reference, the global superpower of the day. And in this time, in order to be a global superpower, you had to have two things. You had to have superior military might and weaponry and technology and force. And the Egyptians did. They had horses and chariots. Their chariots were far more advanced. They had these long spears. They were way ahead of the game in terms of their military technology and the sheer number of warriors that they had. So they dominated the region. Secondly, you had to dominate and have a monopoly on the resources. Egypt did this as well. The number one resource in this part of the world, which is a desert climate, was the Nile River. And Egypt had a monopoly on the Nile River. They owned that junk. And all the land to the left and to the right of the river was more fertile soil, and they owned all those resources. So Egypt was king of the region. They were the global superpower. They ruled, they reigned. Well, this Hebrew man, this simple Hebrew man, is sold into slavery in Egypt named Joseph. And Joseph, through God's providence, rises up through the ranks in Egypt. And he eventually becomes kind of second in command. Modern day example is like he would probably be CFO of Egypt or like Secretary of State of Egypt. He works his way up. And then his brothers, Joseph's 12 brothers, the 12 tribes of Israel, come to Egypt, and they do well in the land there too. And they are all very blessed there. And it says in the text at the very end of Genesis and at the very beginning of Exodus, it says that they begin to multiply. So here, at the very end of Genesis and like the very, very, very first part of Exodus, it seems like the promise has come true or is coming true. All the promises that God made to Abraham seem to be coming true here. They don't have their own land, but maybe that's coming down the road. But they are multiplying like crazy, and they are very blessed. A simple Hebrew slave is now number 2 in charge. So things are going pretty well. Plot twist. A new Pharaoh comes to power. Now, Pharaoh was the king of Egypt. It was just kind of a title. Like in Rome, they had Caesar. In Egypt, they had Pharaoh. A new Pharaoh comes to power. And he sees that these Hebrew people are multiplying like bunnies. And it's starting to make him nervous. And he tells his advisors and his counselors, he says, we must deal shrewdly with the Israelites. We must deal shrewdly with them. Because he is afraid, he's scared that if a global superpower, if one of their enemies rises up against him and attacks him, well, they're numerous, and then the Israelites, they too are numerous, and we'll be kind of like stuck in the middle and sandwiched in the middle, and the Israelites will probably help out our enemies, and we'll be outnumbered, and then they'll just leave the land, and then what do we got? So Pharaoh is nervous about this. So Pharaoh comes up with a plan, a 2-part plan. He goes, I got it. I know what I'm going to do. And the first plan he enacts is slavery. He says, I will appoint taskmasters and slave masters over the children of Israel, and I will make them work. And I will work them so hard that they won't be able to multiply so much because they'll be exhausted and they'll be broken. And so the children of Israel get turned into not really human beings anymore, more like animals or tools or machines. And they are made to make bricks and stack bricks. And their entire existence and their entire worth and value becomes predicated on how many bricks they can make and stack. And their self-worth is tied up in their quota. And so they have to build all these monuments and idols and fortresses for Pharaoh. And they become an oppressed and afflicted people. These two words will be used throughout the text today. But here's the thing, plot twists. It says in the text, I love this, love the irony here. It says that the more Pharaoh oppressed the children of Israel, the more they multiplied. So they frustrated his efforts. I really thought that would work. And the more he oppresses them, the more they multiply. And then the more bricks he has to make, the more humans they make. And he's like, I can't win. So he comes up with the second part of the plan. Genocide. And Pharaoh decides, okay, I know what I'm going to do. I'll kill all the male children. So Pharaoh makes a decree that all of the newborn baby boys are to be taken at birth and cast into the Nile River. And this seems to work at first. But this time, God's provision is over his people. And at the very beginning of Exodus 2, you hear about this Levite man that marries a Levite woman. Now, a Levite was someone from the 12 tribes of Israel. Later on, they would become the priestly order. They would be of the tribe that becomes priests. It says this Levite man meets this Levite woman, probably on like LeviteDating.com or something. They get together, they have a baby, and it says that this baby is special. And it says that this baby is, this word in Hebrew, tov, it's good. Now, I've already kind of primed you guys on who the sermon's about. But the text creates some ambiguity, some mystery, and some drama here. The text does not provide a name for this baby. It just says a child is born. So there's this woman who has a child that is special. He's good. And so this woman decides to hide this child from Pharaoh. And she is successful in doing so for 3 whole months. Now I would argue, as will be a consistent argument throughout the sermon, that this is God's providence over this baby's life. This woman is somehow able to hide this baby for 3 whole months from all Pharaoh's minions. Okay, so we have to talk about something slightly awkward. I get nervous about stuff like this. Okay, so by 3 months old, this baby would have had a certain surgical procedure done that would mark him as a Hebrew male. You guys tracking? This section tracking? We tracking? Like, if this baby grew up to play football in Egypt, he would look different than all the other dudes in the locker room, all the Egyptian dudes in the locker room. We're all good? I don't want to say the word. Okay, good. I think we're all on the same page. Okay, so he would have been able to, you would have seen that this is a Hebrew baby. That factors in later, so just know that. This woman hides the baby for 3 months. After 3 months, she realizes she cannot hide the baby anymore. She's taking too many chances, too many risks. So it says that this woman prepares, now a lot of times in our Bibles it says a basket. She takes a basket. Something fascinating here. She actually takes, the Hebrew word here is a tevah. It's in a different form here, it's tavot, but she takes a tevah and she puts the baby in it. Now tevah means ark. And tevah is the same word used in Genesis, earlier on in Genesis, with the story of Noah and the flood. And God tells Noah to build a tevah, which is very fascinating. So what I would suggest is that a tevah is some kind of a floating structure, an ark, that is supposed to protect and deliver those inside from the watery chaos and certain death. So just like Noah builds a tevah, an ark, to deliver his family from the watery chaos and certain death, so this child's mother provides this tevah here that will save her baby's life, that will deliver her baby from the watery chaos and certain death. So then, and moms in the room, try to empathize with this. This mother does not want to give up her child, but she knows that her child will be killed and cast into the Nile River. So she puts him in this tevah, and I'm sure she was praying over him for protection and safety, and she puts this tevah, this ark, in the Nile River. Now, scholars a lot of times point out the irony here that technically, this woman is doing what she's supposed to lawfully do. So if she got in trouble, she'd be like, whoa, I did put my son in the Nile. So there's kind of an irony here. She put him in a tivah or an ark, but she actually kind of like followed the rules. I would argue to you that God in his providence protected this child in this tivah as he floats down the Nile. Because the Nile River, it's not like somewhere you go fly fishing, okay? It's not like a babbling, tranquil brook, okay? It's a raging river. Like, it's a big river. There's probably lots of boats on it. There's probably wildlife like crocodiles. And I got confused first service. I was going to say a hippopotamus, but I don't know what's the plural for hippopotamus. Is there a zoologist in the crowd? Hippopotamuses? Hippopotami? What is it? Hippopotami? There's hippopotami. Hippopotami in the Nile. Beware, if you ever visit the Nile, watch out for hippopotami. All right. All right. So this was a dangerous river. And God in his providence protects his child as he's going down this raging river. And then check this out. This will blow your mind. In his providence, God protects this baby and leads this baby to the exact right place at the exact right time to the exact right person, because this baby floats down the river to the exact place where Pharaoh's daughter is bathing. And so she's bathing and she's like, oh, what's that? And she sees a baby in a tivah, in an ark. And then it says, and I believe in God in his providence stirs Pharaoh's daughter's heart to compassion, because it says in the text, this exact word is used, that she sees this baby and has compassion upon the baby. And then the text gives us a detail that would freak us out. We go, oh no, she knows. It says that she can clearly see that he is a child of Israel. He is a Hebrew boy. Again, she would physically be able to tell he was a Hebrew boy. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so she could tell he's a Hebrew boy. So what we might think is like, oh no, she's going to kill him, or she's going to cast him into the river. Nope. She has compassion on him, and she takes him as her own. And it says that she drew him out of the river, and she names him Moshe in Hebrew, Moshe. So we call him Moses. And Moshe, the name Moshe comes from the Hebrew word mashah, which means to draw out. So just as Moses was drawn out of the water and drawn out of the slavery in which he was born into, his name is Moshe, drawn out. Then, God in his providence, I would argue, allows Moses to be raised in the household of Pharaoh. Now, being raised in the household of Pharaoh, Moses was probably well educated. He was probably well fed and healthy. He probably learned the history of all the military campaigns of Egypt. He probably learned the history, and I'm going to argue this throughout the sermon, he probably knew the history of these Hebrew slaves. He probably knew the history of the Hebrew nation and the Hebrew people. And I'll point out later, I think he knew the history of the God that the children of Israel worshiped. We'll get to that later. So he was being prepared and groomed to be a leader. And I think that is all because of God's provision, because God knew what was coming down the road. And a lot of scholars point out the irony of this, that the person who was going to defy Pharaoh, who thought he was God of the whole world, the person that was going to defy Pharaoh and lead these measly slaves out of their bondage, grew up right under Pharaoh's nose and was actually trained by Pharaoh's people to be a leader. What beautiful irony. What a great God we serve. I'm just saying, genius. So, Moses grows up in the house of Pharaoh. Then one day, I believe it is God's providence that stirs something in Moses. And it says that Moses, pay attention to these two words, he goes out to see the suffering of his brothers. It doesn't say that Moses wanted to go check out to see what the slaves are doing. Moses seems to know who these people are and who he is. Again, physically, he'd be able to tell he was different, but he knew who he was in relation to these people. And he didn't view what was happening. I feel like the word suffering here kind of gives us a hint at how Moses felt about it. So Moses is like, I'm not going to go see the work these slaves are doing. He says, I'm going to go see the suffering of my brothers. And so Moses goes out and he sees these Hebrew people, and all they have to do all day is stack bricks. And they are just machines and animals. And something in him stirs and he realizes this is really messed up. Then he sees an Egyptian taskmaster and slave driver beat one of the Hebrew slaves to death. And again, Moses gets the stirring to where he's like, this is not okay. Now, what happens next is debated a little bit. Is Moses doing something good? Is Moses doing something bad? Is this a God-appointed thing? We'll talk about it here in a second. But Moses sees this, and it says that he strikes the Egyptian and kills him, and then he buries this Egyptian in the sand, like a cat burying its business in the sand. And he buries this Egyptian in the sand, and then he doesn't tell anybody about it, and he covers it up and he hides it. So there's a lot of debate on this. Did Moses do something good? Is he like Batman in this situation, and he's like God's hand of justice? Or did Moses act in haste? This is debated. I would say that cold-blooded murder like this and covering it up is never really articulated positively in the Old Testament. There's a certain word used when they must devote things to the Lord. That word isn't used here. So I would say actually that perhaps Moses acted in haste here and actually did something bad. But I'll get to this later. God's going to renew, redeem, and restore that, even though Moses did something that wasn't good here. So, through a series of events, word gets to Pharaoh about what Moses has done. And Pharaoh seeks to kill Moses and take his life. So Moses, kind of Scooby-Doo cartoon runs, and he leaves Egypt and looks over his shoulder, and only one time, and he's gone. He's scared. He doesn't want to get in trouble. He does not fess up to what he's done. Instead, he runs. Not super heroic at this point. But God protects, in his providence, he protects Moses as he flees. And Moses comes to this land, Midian. Now, Midian was kind of a desert climate, very wilderness climate. And God provides a situation that will begin to change and shift the character of Moses a bit. And it tells in the text of this episode where Moses comes to this well, this drinking well in Midian. And there's these 7 daughters of the priest of Midian that are at this well drawing water for their people. Well, then a group of bullies, these shepherds, come up and they're like, hey, get off our turf. We want this water. So they drive these women away. And they begin to take all the water. Now, the text is very short here and very vague, but you would think maybe, since Moses is in running mode, we might think that Moses shies away from this. But actually, Moses does something not fearful, but fearless here. And it says that Moses arises. It's this word whom. It's this very active word. He arises, and he drives them away, and drives the shepherds away, and he saves the daughters of the priest of Midian. And they are able to get water again. Now, small detail here. When we read this a lot of times, we kind of think like back to grade school when there's that one kid that takes forever at the water faucet, and you're like, come on. Did you put your mouth on it? It's not like an inconvenience thing or like a bullying thing. Water, this is a desert climate, people. So like water is very important. So if these women did not get their water for the day, like people can die and dehydrate. So it was very important that they got the water to their people. So Moses really saved them here. So these daughters of the priest of Midian return home to their father. And the father's like, where you guys been? And they say, why are you here so early? And they say, well, actually, there's this Egyptian man who, pay attention to this phrasing, delivered us from the hands of the shepherds. Now, the word for delivered here is this Hebrew word, natsal. Say, natsal. All right, try it again. Natsal. Good. It means to deliver. And actually, this phrase, to deliver from the hands of, will be used throughout Scripture to refer back to this Exodus event. So many other times later on in Scripture, it will say, and God delivered the Israelites out of the hands of Egypt. So we see a little foreshadowing here, and perhaps this episode is preparing Moses for something. And then even this specific word, natsal, delivered, is going to be used later on in our passage. And we'll see a connection here. And it's as if God in his providence provides this opportunity, this microcosmic example to prepare Moses for what he's going to have to do, as he is going to have to, natsal, deliver the children of Israel out of the hands of not the shepherds, but the Egyptians. So God in his sovereignty and his providence is preparing Moses in this instance. Well then, Moses settles in here in Midian. He gets married, has a baby, and he gets a new gig as a shepherd. Now, it's interesting to note here that shepherd is a metaphor in the Old Testament, oftentimes for leadership. In the prophets, in the book of Judges, and in the prophets, a lot of times the leadership of Israel is referred to as shepherds. So the religious leaders are referred to as shepherds, the political leaders are referred to as shepherds, and in fact, in the book of Psalms, the great leader, the high leader, God, is referred to as a shepherd. So Moses is kind of given this leadership role to prepare him for the leader that God is going to call him to do. And so he shepherds sheep in the wilderness. Now that might seem like, you're like, that sounds familiar. Let me add one more detail, just to make it a little more salient, a little more clear. Whenever Moses gets to Midian, he's about 40 years old. At the end of this whole Midian episode and event, when he gets to the burning bush, he's going to be 80 years old. So that means for 40 years, Moses leads these sheep through the wilderness. For 40 years, Moses leads sheep through the wilderness. And I believe that he is given this opportunity because of God's providence and because God was preparing him for the day when he will have to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt and shepherd them through the wilderness for 40 years. Do you see the connection there? God is using everything to mold, shape, and prepare Moses for what he's going to call him to do. Even when it just seems like, oh, he's just a shepherd. Nope. God is preparing him to be a leader that is going to shepherd God's people through the wilderness for 40 years and guide them and protect them. So Moses does well for himself in Midian. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, you flash over to Egypt, it says that the Pharaoh that was in charge dies. And a new Pharaoh comes to town. A new Pharaoh comes to power. And perhaps, if you were one of the Hebrew slaves, you might think, ooh, maybe things will change, maybe things will get better. Not so fast. This Pharaoh is even worse than the first one, and he doubles their workload and makes life even more miserable, and he adds to their oppression and their affliction. And so in this moment, this is one of the lowest moments in the history of Israel, and they feel like they can't stack another brick. And many scholars and theologians will say this is one of the most pivotal passages in all Scripture that shows us who God is and what God is like. And as their workload is doubled and they see no hope in sight, their backs are broken, their wills are broken, and they just sink down and they just can't do it anymore. And try to put yourself in their shoes or sandals. They probably thought that God had forgotten about them because they've been doing this for a minute now. And they were exhausted. And they probably look back to Abraham and be like, yeah, well done, God. Thanks for all the promises you made us. We're slaves and we can't work anymore. And in their lowest moment, this is central to the biblical story. It says that they sigh, anak in Hebrew. They sigh, and then they za'ak. They cry out to God. And it seems as if this is one of the ultimate acts of desperation. They za'ak, they cry out to God. And again, at this point, they probably think, he's not going to hear us. The next two verses should blow our minds, and it tells us everything about God. And in Exodus 2:24 and 25, the cry goes up. And Exodus 2:24 starts, and it says, and he heard. And he heard. Because God is the God who hears the cry of the afflicted and the oppressed. He's not too far away from it. And verses 24 and 25 will expound on this, and they both provide 4 key verses that tell us about God and what God does in response to this. It says that God shema, he hears. And then it says God zakar, he remembers. He remembers, and this will tie back to the beginning of the sermon, he remembers the covenant that he made with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. The covenant that the people probably thought God forgot about. He remembers that covenant, and then it says that God, he saw the oppression and affliction of his people, and this is the biggest one. And then he yada, he knows it. Now in Hebrew, there's different words for know. To just kind of understand something, like you explain something to me and I go, oh, I got it. That's probably more the Hebrew word bin. That's not what's used here. Yada is this word that means to know. It's more intimate. It's more empathetic. It's like God is looking them in the eye and saying, I get it. I feel it too. I understand it and I'm with you in it. So we need to see here the character and the nature of God. God is not some detached, dispassionate, deistic God who's just like, put things in motion and is like, peace, I'm out, not interested. God is the God who hears, remembers, sees, and knows of the affliction and the oppression of his people. And at this point in Scripture, everything changes because God says, enough is enough. And God has a plan in place, and everything from here is going to change. Now, how's God going to do this? The people of Israel have no idea. God's got a plan, and I would argue that God has been enacting this plan even before the cry is made with the birth of Moses. So let's flash back over to Midian. So the scene flashes back over to Midian. And what is Moses doing in Midian? What's his gig? What's his job? Well done. For how many years? Nailed it. So Moses is a shepherd. Says that he leaves Midian and he goes into the wilderness. The Hebrew word for this is midbar. Now, the wilderness is a place throughout the Old Testament where it's a dangerous place. It's a place of isolation. It's a place sometimes of temptation. It's a place of chaos and danger. However, it's also a place where God meets people and God cuts people off. And it's sometimes when you get out of the margins, or you get out into the margins, you get away from the everyday life, you get out of the comfort zone, that God confronts people. And this often is what happens in the midbar, in the wilderness. So Moses heads out into the midbar, into the wilderness. And he takes his flock to the very far side, the very westward side. And he comes to the mountain of God. And then Moses notices something very strange. It says that Moses sees a bush that is on fire, but is not consumed. Now here's what I think is interesting about this. The word here in Hebrew for this bush is sineh. And if you study a little bit, it connotes more to like a thorny bush, or some say like a blackberry bush. This isn't like a 40-foot evergreen tree that's like on fire. It's just a simple thorny bush. Might have had some bloom on it. Maybe it was a blackberry bush, blueberry bush. Scholars can test on this. It seems like this mundane, not really special thing, but it's on fire with the presence and spirit of God. And Moses goes, I gotta check this out. So he turns to check it out. And God sees that Moses turns towards the burning bush, and he says, don't come any closer. And then, this is going to be kind of the crux of this entire series, this word. And I want to break down, there's three kind of primary words here, three Hebrew words I want to break down. I almost backed over the plant. All right. I actually wish I would have fallen into the plant. That would have made a great sermon. All right, sorry. Put on my blooper reel. All right. So it says here, crux of the sermon. It says, it uses this Hebrew word, hara. It says, and he called him. And God calls Moses. And this is what we are investigating in this series, this call, this Hebrew word hara. That's the first thing. Second thing is he says, Moshe, Moshe, Moses, Moses. Now in Hebrew, when you see repetition like that, it usually is used, it's employed for some kind of emphasis, importance, or sometimes intimacy. By analogy. It's like when your kid says, mommy, mommy, or when your kid says, daddy, daddy. Very similar here. Kind of similar effect, rhetorical effect. God says, Moshe, Moshe, getting his attention. Second thing. Thirdly, we see Moses' reaction and response. And Moses' reaction and response is going to be vital to the story. And the phrase that he utters in Hebrew is used of any great leader, prophet, or king of Israel before Moses and after Moses when they respond to the hara, the call of God. And Moses says in Hebrew, he uses this phrase, hineni, which means, here I am. And it's this passive, kind of reverent, I'm listening, I'm fully present, what are you asking of me, what do you need? And as a side note, I think this is important for us because we live in a society where we're constantly on the run and we're going in 1,000 different directions and we're always doing stuff and we're always looking around and then we're always on our phone while we're doing it and then we're like running into stuff. I saw a guy in the parking lot the other day texting, he almost ran into a car. I wanted to say something, stop him. but I didn't. Sorry. And I think there's something important here about being fully present and open to what the Lord has to tell us. This word is used a lot. Back in Genesis 22, when God, Hurrah, calls Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, Abraham says, Hanani, here I am. Later on, if you've ever heard the story of Samuel, the prophet Samuel getting called by the Lord as a young child, the Lord, Hurrah, calls out to Samuel and he says, Hanani, here I am. Most of the major prophets have a section where they are called and they say, Hanani, here I am. And so this is the right response of Moses. So then God lets Moses, he puts Moses on notice about where Moses is. And he says, don't come any closer. And he says, take off your sandals, for the ground that you are treading upon is holy. Why take off his sandals? Like, well, what's the big deal? What's the point? I mean, there's significance to this and cultural values to this. It's not like God's like, oh, could you please take off your sandals? You're going to get mud on the carpet, okay? It's not one of those situations. This is a cultural thing. Sandals represented property and possession, and they symbolized dignity. So when you walked, it's as if you were kind of owning the land you walked upon, and you were dignified. When you would enter the home of another, you often would take your sandals off because you did not possess, that was not your property, and you were kind of humbling yourself to whoever owned the house. Similar effect here. God is letting Moses know he does not own this land he's walking on, and he needs to undignify himself and humble himself. And then God says that this ground is holy. Now, the word used here is kodesh, and it means holy, and it is the very first time it is used in Scripture. And when you study the Old Testament, anytime a word is used for the first time, it's usually pretty notable. And God is letting Moses know that something is different about this interaction and this situation. God has come down. His very presence is dwelling in this place. This same word in Hebrew, they would go on to use it to describe the tabernacle, where God's presence would dwell fiercely. They would go on to use it to describe the temple, where God's presence would dwell. So it's like we kind of have a preview of that here. This is kind of like what the tabernacle and the temple is going to be like. This is where the very presence of God burns. A holy place, a sacred, different place. So then, God puts Moses on notice and lets him know who he is. And God says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we see Moses' response. Moses goes, whoa, and he looks away. It says he turns his face away. Apparently he dabs on him. He turns his face away, and he won't look at him. Moses grew up in the house of Pharaoh, where they had a pantheon of gods. Why is he so concerned about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? I argued earlier, I think Moses was well-versed and astute in the history of the Israelites and the God they worshiped. And I think he knew about this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he seems to know about the awe and wonder of majesty and power of this God here. And so he looks away, and he turns his face away, and he cannot look. And so then, God puts Moses on notice and lets him know what God has in mind. And God says, I have seen the affliction of my people, and I have heard their cry. Now, this next part, I love the movement here in the grammar. It says, I have come down to deliver my people and bring them up out of Egypt. I have come down to deliver and bring up. There's this movement here. And the middle term used here, to deliver, is that same verb we discussed earlier, natsal. Say, natsal. Nailed it. He says, I'm going to natsal, deliver my people. And we see the connection here for when Moses, natsal, are delivered, the daughters of the priest of Midian, from the hands of the shepherds. God is going to call him again to natsal, deliver the children of Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. So we see God's plan and what he's going to do. So then, I'm always curious about how Moses felt about this. Because Moses was probably going like, yeah, that's great, sounds good, how you gonna do it? And then God says, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So Moses is like, that's amazing. Yeah, let's do that. Who you got in mind? Who's going to do it? And God says, you, big boy. And Moses freaks out. And Moses, see his response here, he goes, whoa, who am I? I mean, like, I'm not good, me no talking good, me no good with words. I can't speak very well, and like, I don't even really know what your name is, and like, they don't know what your name is, and they don't know that I've talked to you, and they don't like me very much, and then there's like, there's Pharaoh, and then there's like, it's hot out here, and like, also, like, I'm not really a good leader or speaker and stuff like that, and like, you should probably just like find someone else. It's like, cool, good. And Moses freaks out and totally denies what God's calling him to do. But God promises him 3 things. He says, I am going to provide wonders and miracles and signs. I am going to put people in your path and in your life to help you. And most importantly, I'll be honest with you, I'm going to be with you. And that's the most important thing. And then God says, oh, and by the way, Pharaoh's not going to listen to you. So he's telling Moses, go talk to Pharaoh and try to lead my people out. Oh, but he's not going to listen to you. And so God says, that's why I am going to reach out my hand and strike Pharaoh with all of my wonders. And we see the protagonist here is God. The hero here is God. He just needs Moses to be faithful and do what he has called Moses to do. And in this moment, Moses, he's got this very finite view where he's like, I don't know how to do any of that. I can't public speak. I don't know anything. I don't know what I'm doing. As to my premise of this sermon, this is not true. In Moses' perception, perhaps, but this is not true. Because God has used everything in Moses' life to mold and shape and prepare him for what God is now calling him to do. In his providence, God saved Moses' life from the time he was a baby and protected him for those 3 months. God, in his providence, protected Moses as he was put into the ark and floated down this very dangerous, very congested, highly trafficked Nile River with hippopotamus in it, whatever it was. And God protected him. And in his providence, God leads baby Moses to the exact right spot at the exact right time, to the exact right person with Pharaoh's daughter. And in his providence, God stirs the heart of Pharaoh's daughter to have compassion on this slave baby. And in his providence, God allows Moses to grow up in the house of Pharaoh to learn the history of Egypt and learn the history of the Hebrew people and to be trained as a leader. And in his providence, God stirred Moses' heart towards the suffering of his brothers. And in his providence, he allowed Moses to see this. And even when Moses perhaps missteps and acts in haste and does something he shouldn't, I would argue that God renews, redeems, and restores it and makes it part of Moses' story. And actually, it is used to get Moses out of Egypt that he may return to lead God's people out. And in his providence, God protects him as he flees. And in his providence, God provides Moses with a situation at the well that teaches him to deliver people from the hands of their oppressors, which he's going to be asked to do later. And in his providence, God provides Moses with the opportunity to be a shepherd herding sheep through the wilderness for 40 years because he's going to have to herd and guide God's people through the wilderness for 40 years. And in his providence, God led Moses through the wilderness to the mountain of God on that very day that God was going to be dwelling in this Sinai, this simple thorny bush, this blackberry bush, and the fire and the Holy Spirit of God would burn it. And his providence, God led Moses to that exact spot at that exact time to do that exact thing that God was calling him to do. The burning bush, Hope Church, was not an accident and it wasn't random. Everything in the story led up to this moment, and Moses had been molded, shaped, and prepared to do what God was calling him to do. And it is no different with us. However, in the moment, it often seems like it's completely random. I'll give you some stories here of some people I know. I have a friend named Samuel. He's from Romania. He lives in Texas now. And he started this company called Roma Boots. Has anyone ever heard of Roma Boots? They've been on he's been on the Today Show and Good Morning America. I'm sure he's been on The View. I don't know. I don't watch The View. I don't know. But he's been on a lot of TV shows. And he grew up in Romania, and it was very poverty-stricken there. And there were very harsh elements. And he said they would have to walk to school every day in thick snow. And because of the poverty, a lot of times, shoes were passed on from kid to kid. So by the time, if you were the youngest kid, by the time you got shoes, they had holes in them. Or some kids just had cloth shoes. And you have to traipse through the snow in these cloth shoes or shoes with holes in them. And a lot of the kids there would get hypothermia and frostbite on their feet, and their toes would fall off. Additionally, the education system there is horrible. So Samuel moves to America. He decides he wants to go into the fashion industry, and he starts working for Nordstrom. But he's just a guy there. I forget what he did at Nordstrom. Was he buying or something, purchasing? He just worked a job at Nordstrom. But he felt this calling to start this company. And through signs and wonders and miracles, God opened up doors and brought people alongside Samuel to where he could start this company, Roma Boots, where he would provide boots for these kids in Romania. It's kind of a buy one, get one, just like Tom's. In fact, he met with the guy who started Tom's. He met with his dad to ask about their business structure. And so you can go to their website, Roma Boots, and they do beautiful work. They do amazing work. And so when you buy a pair of Roma Boots, you get one pair, and another pair goes to a child somewhere. And then 10%, usually in Romania, but they're working in other parts of the world now too, and then 10% of everything he makes goes towards these educational initiatives in these countries. He was just a dude who worked for Nordstrom. But God had a calling on his life and worked wonders. There's this guy where I moved here from. I moved here from Branson, Missouri. Anyone ever heard of it? It's kind of like a redneck Vegas. It's where Vegas careers go to die. That's what I always say. Okay. Don't Google it. In Branson, Missouri, there's this friend of mine. His name is Brian Stallings. And he and his wife, Amy, just felt compelled one year. They felt called to have this Thanksgiving feast for the homeless population in Branson because the economy there is a little bit rough because it's seasonal. It's touristy. And so they hosted it at a church, and they got to meet all these homeless people doing this thing God called them to do. But then there was ongoing call because in doing this, they met all these homeless people, and they found out that they all live in extended stay motels. And there was 50 of them in Branson. And then they felt called, and they started this program called Jesus Was Homeless, where they would make these lunches and these dinners for people, and they would deliver them to all these extended stay motels. And they started doing it with more frequency. It started getting more participation, and God brought more people alongside them, and they became more networked. I started working with him a little bit. One of my favorite ministries I've ever seen. It is beautiful. And this led to them establishing relationships with these people, which then led him to want to start a cookout barbecue where they would also have a Bible study, which led to people coming to Christ and getting baptized, which led to him buying a storefront and starting a church there. And the tagline of the church was, church for people who don't like church. And then people just kept getting saved, and people kept surrendering their life to Christ, and he kept baptizing people. And then he got networked with one of the biggest churches in America called Gateway Church in Texas, and they became kind of a sister satellite church, and they actually broadcast from Gateway. And now they're building this big, new, beautiful facility where they can do their church, and they can do this ministry where they deliver meals to these extended stay motels. And they have this thing called Jobs for Life, where they take homeless people in and they teach them job skills and how to go make something with their lives. And they have graduates of this program. Because God worked wonders and brought people alongside them because they did this one thing that God called them to do. And you know what? Brian, when I left Branson, Brian was working for some Comcast type company. He's just a dude. But he was called by God. So I talked about a friend who was from Romania, lives in Texas now, Missouri. There's something going on right under your nose, Hope Church. It's called summer lunch. And 5 years ago, Meredith, our children's minister here, and the former pastor here were invited to go to this luncheon at Must Ministries. And they learned that there's these kids that receive kind of, government-subsidized lunches at school. Their meals are provided for at school during the school year. And these kids, they don't have school lunches in the summer because they're not at school. So what are they supposed to eat? So there's a summer lunch program where they go around and they deliver meals in the summer to these kids that would normally get it at school. Well, this is over in Cobb County. And Meredith told me she was terrified when she first heard about this. She was scared to death. She loved it, and she absolutely felt called to do it. But she says it was scary. But she started doing it, and people here at Hope Church rose up to do it. I can tell you now, 5 years later, this church operates as its own independent, self-sufficient entity, along with 2 other organizations and random groups in our county, in Paulding County, and we have what's called Paulding County Lunch. And 5 years later, this has turned into a network here, and kids all over Paulding County are receiving these lunches because someone was called to do something. Meredith used to work for a neurologist. I mean, it's not like she has a background in this stuff. But God had prepared things along the way and worked wonders and brought people alongside us so that this is a thriving ministry now. And I would challenge you that if you've never been involved in summer lunch, okay, if you don't have time to make sandwiches, that's okay. If you always forget to bring food, whatever, show up one day and just ride along. Just go with them. I challenge you to do that. But there's a calling there. So I would ask you, I'd end today by asking, what are you called to do? And I realize in a room this size, there's probably some people that are like, listen, bro, I've been doing this forever. I know what my calling is. I've put in my time. I'm retired. Maybe that's even in ministry. Or you're like, listen, I've worked the same job for years and years and years. I'm all done. I'm all set. Or maybe you even worked in this church and worked in ministries here, and you're like, oh my gosh, I put in my time. I'm retiring. I'm good. I'm exhausted. I always respect that. And as a young man, I have reverence for people like that. Reverence for people like that. But let me tell you something real quick. When Moses was at the burning bush, he was 80 years old. 80 years old. So if you're here today and you think you're done and you're retired from life or from ministry or for something God's calling you to do, I can tell you right now, you're not done. And I would pray that the Lord stirs your heart for that next thing God is calling you to do. And for those of you in the room who feel, as I have felt so many times in my life, completely directionless, completely compassless, and you don't know where you're supposed to go, what you're supposed to do. I don't know, everyone always talks about calling, and you feel kind of lost in it. I can assure you that every single thing that has happened in your life has happened for a reason. And there is not chaos and variance, there's providence. And that just like Moses, God has used every single thing in your life to mold and shape and to prepare you for that thing that God is calling you to do. So the suffering you've experienced in your life has not been in vain. The pain that you have experienced is not purposeless. And even the wrong things you've done, like Moses killing a guy, even the wrong things you've done can be renewed and redeemed and restored for what God is calling you to do. And there is no waste in God's economy because everything works together for good. And God uses everything you've been through to prepare you for what he's calling you to do next. So there's this kind of art. It's called mosaic. And let's get the pictures of broken glass up there. In mosaic, they take these fragments of glass, some things often broken, and a master artist and a creative genius takes these broken pieces of glass and makes something beautiful with them and makes a bigger picture. This is called mosaic. And I would say that a lot of times in our life, we look around and we see a lot of broken glass. We've had shattered dreams. Our hearts have been broken. things we endeavored and set out to do kind of fell apart. Or life just kind of shattered. Or that everything in your life just seems kind of random and variant. Like, I don't know, I can't really put it all together. It just seems so scattered and there's no really semblance or reason to it. But I can assure you that God is a master artist, the ultimate creative genius. And God will use that broken glass in your life. And even though it seems like, I don't know what's going on, I'm not ready for this, God has been molding, shaping, and preparing you for what he's calling you to do. And that God will take the broken glass in your life and make something beautiful with it and show you a bigger picture. And so what we often see as broken glass, God will see as a starry night. And it's something that has the potential for great beauty in this world. So as we enter into this last time of singing, I specifically asked Taylor to do this song because I have sung this song at times in my life where I felt like I was at the bottom and I had no idea where to go or what to do. And I remember standing in church a couple times and just putting my arms up and just saying, Lord, I surrender, not my will, but yours be done, and have your way, because if I do stuff, it's just gonna be no good. So I would encourage you in this moment to pray that prayer, to open yourself up to the Lord like that. And it is my prayer that in this moment, as we do this, that the Holy Spirit of God, that same Holy Spirit that burned in fire in the burning bush, that was aflame but not consumed, that same fire would burn in your heart and compel you towards that next thing that God is calling you to do. And it is my prayer that the Holy Spirit enters this room and begins to stir, and that this ground becomes holy ground, to where our countenance is changed and we're different when we leave this place. So as we enter into this time, whether by whisper or a mighty wind, I pray that the Holy Spirit of God would stir you and compel you to that next thing he's calling you to do. And when God does call you, my prayer for this church is that we would respond faithfully, Haneni, here I am. And it is my prayer for this church that we realize that every single person here, we are all called to be a part of what God is doing in the world. The God who hears and remembers and sees and knows the suffering of the oppressed and the afflicted. So may the Lord stir your heart and speak to you in this moment. Grace and peace to you, Hope Church.